Okay, we're doing Unit 2, Entry 2, Organic Chemistry Introduction. Part 1 today is on the basics of organic chemistry. So the idea today is how are biology and chemistry connected? How are nutrition and chemistry connected? We might talk about that a little bit, but let's think more back to the idea of what we talked about yesterday, which is plastics, recycling, and the difference between organic chemistry and our class and organics in the food industry. So first we have some vocab, numbers 1, 2, and 3 here. This is the smallest unit of an element that maintains the chemical properties of an element. These are all pure substances. So my answer can be found here. Number 1, the answer would be smallest unit. Would be right there. It would be atoms. Okay, so I'm just going to use arrows here and draw it down. Oops. Okay. Number 2, a substance that cannot be separated, broken down into simpler substances by chemical means. That means chemical reaction. All atoms of an element have the same atomic number. Okay. This would be an element. I cannot separate an element any further. So an atom is the smallest thing. Elements, you realize you have two categories. You have atoms and molecules, which means the last one, compound, is number 3. That's a substance made up of atoms of 2 or more different elements joined by chemical bonds, and that's what I see here and here. Those are 2 different types of compounds. You have molecules and ions there. So atoms, elements, compounds. Yeah, just a classic chemistry meme for you. A molecule is just 2 things that are bonded together. They can be the same atom or different atoms. And a molecule is a molecule that's wearing sunglasses. So what is a chemical bond? Chemical bonds are really important. They are the glue that keep atoms together. They can join atoms of the same element together or atoms of different elements. What are chemical bonds? These are how 2 or things, 2 or more atoms are connected. So chemical bond is number 4. Okay. Organic, if you look over here, it's the chemistry of carbon. And inorganic is things that don't have carbon. Okay, so this organic is number 5, inorganic is number 6. So hydrocarbon is number 7. This is an organic compound of things composed of only carbon and hydrogen. So what do you notice about the names of many of these things? Maybe you recognize them, like butane, propane, even ethane. These are hydrocarbons that you've heard of. Hydrocarbon, hydro, referring to the hydrogen, carbon, referring to the carbon molecule. So number 7 is hydrocarbon. And if you look at saturated and unsaturated, again, if you ask, what do you notice about everything on the saturated side, which is number 8, and the unsaturated side, number 9. Well, on the saturated side, I only see these single lines between things. And on the unsaturated side, sometimes I see 3, sometimes I see 2. And what this is called a single bond. Okay, 3 lines you can imagine would be called a triple bond, and this would be called a double bond. Okay, so unsaturated ones have a double or a triple bond in them, and saturated only have single bonds. If you look at the names of these single bonded ones, they're all ANEs. ENEs are double bonds, and a triple bond would actually be called an alkyne. It ends with YNE, which we'll get to later this week. So R groups, these are also called functional groups. This is the active portion of a compound that determines its chemical properties. Example, amino acids, they all have an amino chain, a carboxylic acid chain, a hydrogen, and then on this side they have different R groups, or different things that are attached that make the amino acid a different shape and a different chemical activity, which means that when your body's building proteins, it puts together these amino acids in structures that allow them to interact in a way that creates the shape of the protein. And if you remember from last year, shape determines function when it comes to proteins. So lastly, we have 2 types of bonds. We have covalent and ionic bonds. Covalent is about shared electrons. Electrons are shared. Ionic bonds are where electrons are fully given or taken. And then you get charged atoms. So notice in all of these, you just have lines going between them. You don't have charged atoms. But in ionic bonds, you get a positive and a negative charge, and then those two things are attracted to each other. So covalent bond, nice little thing here. No bond is stronger than between carbon atoms that in the covalent structure of a diamond. And that's actually true. Yeah, that's a very, very strong and stable bond because of the nature. And carbon's able to actually form these, like, we call them tetrahedral structures, where it's like very, very strong like this. You know, you can think about drawing a cube, and at every part of the cube, you have a carbon connected to 4 different carbons, right? And that's kind of how we get our diamond structure. And not that you need to know that, but it is what it is. That's why diamonds are so strong. So think about this question. We're gonna roll through the notes here. What are we made out of as people? What is our genetic material made out of? What is it? And what are amino acids, and what elements are found in amino acids and nucleotides? And what you'll see today is one, and this ties back to your what is organic from yesterday. What are all these living things composed out of? So organic chemistry is also called the chemistry of carbon. It's all about carbon. And all living things are made up of organic or carbon compounds. And why is carbon special? It forms 4 covalent bonds. So think about that diamond structure that we drew right here. 1, 2, each carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds going to it. Okay. And this is because it has 4 valence electrons. Remember, it's in column 14. And the 14 and the 4 and 14 tells me I have 4 valence electrons, which means it's halfway full. 4 out of 8 slots are full. 4 out of 8 slots are full. So if I form 4 bonds, I get to 8 out of 8. And just a reminder that chemical bonds store energy. So when bonds are broken, that energy is released. And that's what your metabolism is. That's what eating is. It's breaking those chemical bonds and using it to do something. And in your body, these reactions of breaking bonds are happening all the time. In the time it takes you to read this statement, 8.5 trillion reactions are occurring. Think about all the energy needed, or all the energy needed in your body to move a muscle, and how rapidly your ATP has to be used in order for that to happen. Okay, so 8.5 trillion chemical reactions are occurring in your cells, like moment to moment, and that is your metabolism. So what are humans made out of? This is by mass. By mass, we are composed mostly of oxygen. And you'd ask, why is that? Well, in the periodic table, the mass of oxygen is 16, the mass of carbon is 12, and the mass of hydrogen is 1. So if I have a molecule that I'm made primarily of, H2O, 16 here, 2 H's gives me 2 grams there, or 2 parts of mass. That means most of my mass is actually coming from oxygen in the water that's in my body. So what are we made out of? Mostly oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. The reason why calcium, its mass is 20, and it's a major component both in your muscles and in your bones. You also have small amounts of other elements such as potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. These ones are mostly important in how your cells function. They don't actually make up a lot of these structures of your body. These elements make up the structures of your body. And some sulfur in your structure, but that's the reason why. And realize these are all elements found in the periodic table, connecting it to what we've learned about already. So what's the genetic material of all living things? And we should know this. DNA, which is made up of 2 basic parts, nucleotides, the G, the C's, the T's, and the A's, and a sugar phosphate backbone. All those are made up of elements, and if you had to guess which elements, hopefully you'd realize that it's a carbon-based chain. So remember, we have our double helix, we have our A's and our T's together, our G's and our C's, wrapped around the sugar phosphate backbone. And if you were to break it down, what is A made out of? What is T made out of? What is G, C, and the sugar phosphate backbone? What are all those things made out of? You'd realize it's carbon primarily. So this is really confusing. Notice in my sugar phosphate backbone, I have a phosphorus. I have a lot of oxygen. Okay? And then you'd be like, well, what are these line things? Well, right here, that's a bond between this element and that in oxygen. But where 2 lines meet, those are actually carbons. So the primary structure of this element is carbon, 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 and I have double bonds and single bonds between them. So the major elements here, if you take a look, are P, O, C, H, and N. And actually the metaphor that you'll hear a lot is schnapps as my elements. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And sulfur. Here the S means sugar. Okay? Means sugar. So there's a phosphate, that's a sugar, and then you have your G's and your C's and your A's and your T's together. So it's genetic material made out of, it's organic molecules, meaning they contain carbon. So they're, again, it's carbon compounds that are making up your body. And these are just more basic structure here. Our phosphate, our sugar, and then our base is attached, whether it's a G, a C, or an A, or a T. So what are proteins made out of? Proteins are long chains of amino acids. And what happens is your body adds circles, in this case, different amino acids, to the end as it's reading your mRNA, if you remember that from last year. And each of these things has a different R group attached to them, right? That's your functional group. So these are chains of amino acid. And because of that, say this is positive and this is a positively charged one, they're going to push away from each other. And then say on this side, there was a negatively charged one and a negatively charged one. Now these positives are also going to be pulled towards your negatives, and you get a folding process for your amino acid. You get positives and negatives folding down towards each other, and then you ended up with a folded protein. So if I look at these, we have all of our different amino acids. We have non-polar, which means it doesn't have positive or negative ends. We have polar, which means it has positive and negative sides. And we have charged ones. See how it has a negative here or a positive there? All of those things create the electrochemical structure of amino acids, and therefore cause your body to fold it into a specific structure, which determines its function. So organic molecules are used to make proteins. These are the building blocks of life. And these are mostly made out of, again, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. You just have to look at the elements that are here. Lastly, sugar is how we get most of our elements. Glucose is the most common one. Photosynthesis is the opposite process where instead of using sugar for energy, plants are making glucose from light energy. Oops. Okay, so if I look at photosynthesis, I take CO2 and water, I make glucose and oxygen. In our bodies, we break down energy. Notice that these things are just flip-flopped, where I'm taking in energy to make photosynthesis happen, and I'm creating or manipulating energy to get it. And so our body produces CO2 and H2O, which is then used to make sugar and oxygen in photosynthesis. So energy from our chemical bonds is being broken and captured and put in new ATP. And your thought must be, okay, well, what's happening? Why do we use ATP and not food directly? ATP is the energy source because it's one major molecule. Think about different outlets and plugs. If every single item in your home had a different shape of plug, you'd have to have all those different plug outlets in the walls. But if you just choose one standard version, then every outlet can be the same, and that's what your body does with ATP. It's the plug to make sure that we only need one outlet. Okay. So here's a process of how ATP is made. I don't know if it's going to play here. Let's see. Okay, well, what happens here is that these hydrogens come across this gradient, is what we call it. And when it does that, it releases energy, and that energy is used to add this phosphorus to an ADP, diphosphate, to make ATP. Then those ATPs are attached to, like, say, a protein here. This is how your muscle fibers work, is you have these motor proteins that attach to the protein, and as the ATP is plugged in and used, the phosphorus breaks off, so it'll look like this again, and that energy is used to move your motor protein along the pathway. And so you should be thinking about how those things are connected in your mind. And lastly, we're using these molecules for energy, which is what you see here. All right, see you later.